My name is Alex, and for a season that felt like a lifetime, I was the sole winter caretaker at the Silverwood Grand Lodge. It's a colossal, timber-framed ghost perched high in the Cascade Mountains, a place so thoroughly cut off from the world that my nearest neighbor was a park ranger station a full day's hike away, and that was assuming the pass wasn't buried under 20 feet of snow. The job paid an almost criminal amount of money, the kind of sum that makes you ignore a dozen different red flags, the kind of money you only take when you're running from something. In my case, it was a mountain of debt and a life that had spectacularly imploded back in the city, leaving me with little more than the clothes on my back and a desperate need to disappear. The man who hired me, Mr. Croft, was the lodge's owner, though in our single, strange conversation, he seemed more like its curator, or perhaps its warden. He was a reed-thin man with a face like old parchment, and he conducted our interview over a crackling landline that hissed with static, as if the connection were being stretched across a century. He wasn't interested in my resume, my references, or my limited experience with industrial heating systems. He was far more interested in my psychological resilience. He asked questions like, "Are you comfortable with silence, Alex?" True, profound silence. And do you find your own company sufficient for long stretches? I assured him I did, that solitude was what I was looking for. He made a dry, rustling sound that might have been a chuckle. At the end of the call, after confirming my exorbitant salary and the fact that all supplies, from food to fuel, were already stocked for the entire winter, he gave me the only rule that seemed to truly matter to him. He delivered it with the somber weight of a final, non-negotiable warning, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to catch in his throat. "The guests are the lifeblood of the Silverwood, Alex," he'd said, the static crackling around his words like a dying fire. "They are particular. They value their privacy above all else. You will provide for their needs. You will be courteous, but you must never, under any circumstances, ask them about their departure date." I'd offered a nervous laugh, a sound that got lost in the hiss of the line. I assumed it was some quirky billionaire eccentricity, a desire to create a hotel that felt like a permanent, exclusive home for his long-term clientele, an escape from the scheduled, hurried world below. I assured him I understood completely. Privacy was paramount. It was a simple, if odd, rule to follow. I was being paid to be a glorified janitor and a silent butler, not to pry into the affairs of the wealthy. I needed the money too badly to question the strange conditions attached to it. So I said yes. I packed my life into 2 duffel bags and took the last transport shuttle up the winding mountain road before the pass was officially closed for the season, leaving the noise and the wreckage of my old life far behind me. The first month was idyllic in a stark, lonely, and profoundly quiet way. The lodge was a masterpiece of rustic architecture, a monument to a bygone era of timber-barren opulence. It was all soaring ceilings with dark, hand-hewn wood beams the size of telephone poles, and colossal stone fireplaces that could have roasted an entire ox. My days fell into a comfortable, repetitive rhythm that was almost meditative. I'd wake before dawn, the silence of the snow-drowned world, so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. In the city, there was always a hum, a distant siren, the rumble of subway. Here, there was nothing, a pure void of sound that my brain struggled to process. My rounds began in the basement, a labyrinthine space of fieldstone walls and packed earth floors that smelled of damp and cold. The massive boilers were down there, 2 groaning iron behemoths that served as the building's mechanical heart. I checked their pressure gauges, listened to the rhythmic, comforting chug of their machinery, and feel the heat they pumped into the web of sweating copper pipes that snaked through the walls above, keeping the old lodge breathing against the crushing cold. It felt like I was tending to the life support of a slumbering giant. Then I'd shovel the main walkways, a task that could take hours after a heavy snowfall. My breath would plume in the frigid air, the rhythmic squeak and crunch of my boots on the packed snow the only sound for miles around. The sheer scale of the place was humbling. There were entire wings of the lodge that were closed for the winter, their grand furniture shrouded in white cloths, standing silent and still as the contents of a pharaoh's tomb. I could wander for an hour and not see another soul. Sometimes, the only thing that reminded me I wasn't completely alone was the sight of a single, soft yellow light burning in a distant window or a thin, lazy curl of smoke rising from one of the guests' sweet chimneys against the stark white sky. There were only 7 guests that winter. They were as much a part of the lodge's fixtures as the taxidermy elk heads on the walls, their expressions equally placid and unchanging. There was Mr. Abernathy, a man who must have been deep into his 80s, always impeccably dressed in a heavy tweed suit that seemed a size too big for his frail, skeletal frame. He spent his days in the cavernous library, sitting in a leather wingback chair and staring at the same page of a leather-bound book for hours on end, his finger occasionally tracing lines of text he never seemed to be actually reading. There were the 2 Sinclair sisters, pale, unervingly similar women with long, dark hair and high-collared, Victorian-style dresses. They moved with a silent, synchronized grace, like a pair of perfectly mirrored dancers, their steps making no sound on the thick carpets. When they spoke, which was rare, it was in whispers that were immediately swallowed by the vastness of the rooms they occupied. Then there was a young couple, the Millers, who were the very picture of quiet, unending melancholy. They would take long, silent walks in the snow, never holding hands, never speaking, their faces etched with a profound and shared sadness that seemed as permanent as the mountains. And finally, there was Mrs. Gable, a woman with a perpetually vacant, pleasant smile, who favored thin floral dresses despite the season and hummed softly to herself. And Mr. Henderson, a stoic, broad-shouldered man who would stand by the grand lobby window for entire afternoons, motionless as a statue, watching the snow fall with an intensity that suggested he was waiting for something specific to appear within the swirling white flakes. They were all polite, but impossibly, unnaturally distant. They would offer a slight, almost imperceptible nod as I brought them their meals, simple, pre-prepared dishes I just had to heat up as per their standing orders for the entire season. They would thank me quietly, their voices thin and dry like rustling leaves, when I stoked a fire in the grand hall. But they never spoke to each other. They never gathered, never acknowledged one another's presence beyond a shared, silent occupation of the same vast space. For a building housing 8 people, it was the quietest place I had ever been. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, and taut. It was the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, a long, drawn-out pause before a scream. In that heavy silence, I found myself thinking about Mr. Croft's strange rule more and more, not out of idle curiosity, but with a growing, inexplicable sense of dread. It wasn't a request for privacy. It was a warning. The first truly strange thing happened about 6 weeks into my stay, deep into a January that had been nothing but an endless succession of slate-gray skies and silent, steady, accumulating snowfall. It was a Tuesday. I remember that with perfect clarity, because Tuesday was the day I did a full inventory of the walk-in pantry. It was a task that provided a welcome break from the monotony of my other duties. It was a simple matter of counting cans and boxes, of interacting with a tangible reality in a place that was beginning to feel increasingly ethereal and dreamlike. The lodge, I had discovered, had enough non-perishables to last a small army through a decade-long winter, a fact that had seemed like sensible over-preparation at first, but was slowly starting to feel like something else, something more permanent. I was deep inside the cavernous, chilled space, my breath fogging in the cold, still air. The only sounds were the scratching of my pen on my clipboard and the low, constant hum of the massive freezer unit against the far wall. The air smelled of cardboard, tin, and a faint, sweet scent of dried herbs and spices that hung in the air like dust motes. I was at the back of the pantry, standing on a small stepladder to count tins of smoked oysters on a high metal shelf when I first heard it. It was faint, just on the very edge of hearing a soft, melodic humming. It was a woman's voice, weaving a simple, sorrowful tune that I didn't recognize. It sounded like a lullaby, perhaps, but one steeped in a deep and ancient sadness. I paused my counting, holding a small, flat can of oysters in my hand, and tilted my head, listening intently. The sound was clear, but distant, and seemed to be coming from outside the pantry. My first and most logical thought was that it was one of the Sinclair sisters. They were the only ones who ever seemed to make any sound at all, and even that was usually just a barely audible whisper. I imagined one of them was humming to herself in the nearby kitchen as she waited for her afternoon tea. I set my clipboard down on a sack of flour and stepped out of the pantry, the heavy insulated door sighing shut behind me with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing the cold air inside. The kitchen was empty. It was a vast, sterile expanse of stainless steel countertops and gleaming appliances, all silent under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. There was not a soul in sight. The silence in here was heavy, broken only by the hum of the industrial refrigerators. The humming, however, was clearer now, seeming to emanate from the grand dining hall, which was just beyond a set of swinging kitchen doors. My curiosity piqued. I pushed one of the doors open a crack and peered through the small, circular window. The dining hall was a vast, cathedral-like room, lined with 24 empty tables, each draped in a pristine white cloth, their place settings perfectly and immaculately arranged for guests who would never arrive. The only occupied table was in the far corner, beside the panoramic, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the snow-choked valley. Mrs. Gable sat there alone, as she always did for her midday tea, a single china cup and saucer on the table before her. She was staring out at the endless, hypnotic expanse of snow-covered pines, that same vacant, pleasant smile fixed on her face. The humming was definitely coming from her. It was a strange, haunting little melody that seemed to hang in the oppressive quiet of the room, a looping, minor-key tune that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It sounded ancient, a lullaby from a forgotten time, and the fact that it was coming from this smiling, silent woman was deeply and profoundly unsettling. Not wanting to disturb her or break the unspoken code of silence that governed the lodge, I gave a polite, deferential nod in her direction, a gesture I was sure she wouldn't see. She didn't seem to notice me, her eyes fixed on the falling snow. I let the door swing silently shut and retreated back toward the kitchen, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. It was just a woman humming, I told myself. Nothing to be alarmed about. But as I passed the main entryway to the hall, I glanced down the long, dim corridor toward the library. Through the crack in the heavy oak door, which was always left slightly ajar, I could see Mr. Abernathy, the old man in the tweed suit. He was standing by the bookshelves near the window, his back to me, a tall, stooped silhouette against the dusty gray light. And he was humming. It was a low, wheezing, breathy sound, the sound of air passing through ancient, tired lungs, but it was the exact same sorrowful, looping melody that Mrs. Gable was humming in the dining hall. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest, so sharp and sudden it made me gasp for air. It was too perfect, too synchronized. There was no conceivable way he could have heard her from that distance, not through the thick stone walls and heavy, sound-dampening oak doors of the old lodge. I stood frozen in the hallway, my blood turning to ice, and I just listened, my ears straining. Her humming continued from the dining hall, soft and steady and melodic. His was a low, wheezing counterpoint from the library, a ghostly, reedy echo. It was as if they were performing a duet from opposite ends of the building, a song that only they and now I could hear. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. It had to be a coincidence, an incredible one-in-a-million fluke. Maybe it was a tune from a popular radio show from their generation, a shared memory that had bubbled to the surface at the exact same moment. It had to be that. Anything else felt wrong. It felt coordinated. It felt unnatural. I forced myself to move, my boots suddenly feeling leaden and clumsy, their sound obscenely loud on the polished floorboards. I walked back to the pantry, the familiar task of counting cans a welcome anchor to the world of logic and reason. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The two melodies, perfectly harmonized yet completely separate, played on a loop in my head for the rest of the day. That night, I lay awake in my small caretaker's apartment in the lodge's ground floor, listening to the wind howl outside my window. The sound seemed to twist and shape itself, the gusts of air rising and falling in a familiar, sorrowful tune. I got up and pressed my ear against the cold wall, listening to the groans and sighs of the old building. And I could almost hear it, a faint, phantom humming resonating through the very bones of the lodge. The incident had left a crack in the foundation of my carefully constructed piece. The silence of the Silverwood Grand was no longer just empty. It was filled with something I couldn't hear, a secret conversation passing through the very walls of the building, and I was the only one who didn't know the language. The weeks that followed were a slow, creeping descent into a state of heightened, gnawing anxiety. The humming incident had been like a loose thread, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more the fabric of my reality seemed to unravel. The isolation I had once mistaken for peace began to feel like a cage, and the ever-present, ever-deepening snow was no longer a beautiful blanket, but a prison wall, sealing me in. My world had shrunk to the groaning timbers of a lodge, the mournful sighing of the wind, and the seven silent, watchful figures who drifted through its halls like specters. The second major incident happened during a routine boiler check in the sprawling, dimly lit labyrinth of the basement. This was my least favorite part of the lodge, a place of cold stone and sweating pipes that always felt older and more secretive than the rest of the building. The air was thick with the smells of damp earth, ozone from the electrical panels, and something else, something like old cold decay. I was monitoring the pressure gauges on the main boiler, the rhythmic metallic chugging of the machinery, a comforting mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise oppressive silence. That's when I saw the book. It was lying on a dusty old crate in a forgotten corner, a small, leather-bound diary, its cover warped and stained by decades of time and damp. My first thought was that it must have been left by a previous caretaker, though I couldn't imagine why it would be left down here. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in a place like this, got the better of me. I picked it up, wiping a thick layer of gray grime from the cover with my sleeve. There was no name, no inscription. The pages were filled with elegant, looping cursive, written in faded brown ink. It was a caretaker's log, the first entry dated November 5th, 1923. I sat down on the crate, my flashlight beam cutting a bright, dancing circle in the oppressive gloom, and I began to read. The entries were mundane at first, detailing snowfall totals, dwindling wood supplies, and the temperamental nature of the very same boiler I was sitting next to. The writer, a man named Thomas, had a clear, concise style. But then about a month into his entries, the tone began to shift, subtly at first, then with growing alarm. He started writing about the guests who had arrived for the winter. They're a quiet sort, one entry read. They keep to themselves. Peculiar, but pleasant enough. They arrived together just before the first big snow and seemed content to wait out the winter. As I read further, a cold dread began to seep into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. Thomas started describing the guests in more detail. He wrote of an elderly gentleman in a tweed suit who spends all his time in the library, a Mr. Abernathy. He mentioned the two pale Sinclair sisters, who are inseparable and speak only in whispers. He described a young couple, the Millers, who seemed terribly unhappy and walked the grounds for hours without a word. My heart started to pound against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. It was them. He was describing them. The names, the descriptions of their habits, were too perfect, too specific to be a coincidence. He was describing the same people who were upstairs, right now, nearly a century later. I flipped through the pages frantically, my flashlight beam dancing over the spidery script. The final entries were panicked and disjointed, the neat cursive devolving into a desperate, almost illegible scrawl. "The snow keeps coming," Thomas wrote. "It has not stopped for weeks. Supplies are fine, but the quiet. God, the quiet. They just watch the snow. They don't seem to eat. They just watch." Another entry from a few days later, December 14th. "The Sinclair girls stood at the end of my hall last night. Just stood there in the darkness. When I shone my lantern on them, they were gone, but the floorboards were frosted over where they had been standing." The last entry was a single, terrifying sentence, scrawled across the page as if written in a great hurry, the ink smudged and blotted. I asked Mr. Abernathy when he thought the pass might clear. He just smiled at me. He didn't answer. There were no more entries after that. The rest of the book was empty. I slammed the diary shut, a cloud of dust exploding in the beam of my flashlight, making me cough and choke. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold it. This was impossible. It had to be a prank, an elaborate, cruel story left behind by some bored predecessor with a twisted sense of humor. It had to be, but the descriptions, they were flawless. The frost on the floorboards. I remember the unnatural, bone-deep chill I sometimes felt when passing the sisters in the halls. I shoved the diary into my coat pocket, the feel of it a cold, hard, rectangular knot against my ribs. I fled the basement, the rhythmic chug of the boiler now sounding like a countdown to some terrible, inevitable revelation. My paranoia, now rooted in something tangible, intensified. I began to watch them, to study them. I saw the Millers walking through the deep snow on the back lawn, and just as Thomas had implied they didn't eat, I saw that they didn't disturb the world around them either. When they returned to the lodge, I rushed to the window, my heart in my throat. The lawn was a perfect, unbroken sheet of white. They had left no footprints. I started paying close attention to their meals. The plates were always returned to the kitchen with the food barely touched, just pushed around with a fork to give the impression of having been eaten. They never consumed anything, yet they never faded. They were like photographs from a forgotten album, perfectly preserved and unchanging. After this discovery, I found myself thinking of Mr. Croft's words again, not as a rule, but as a plea. You must never, under any circumstances, ask them about their departure date. I now suspected the reason was that the question itself was a logical fallacy. They had no departure date because they had never truly arrived. Then came the blizzard, and with it, the next level of strangeness. The forecast had warned of a major storm, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and then the world simply disappeared behind a vertical wall of shrieking, blowing white. The wind howled like a living thing, a hungry animal tearing at the lodge. The power went out on the second day, and I fired up the massive diesel generator in the sub-basement, its deafening roar a welcome defiance against the storm's supernatural fury. Late one night, during the storm's peak, I heard something impossible over the generator's roar and the wind's scream. Music. It was faint, the sound of a waltz being played on an old, tinny phonograph. It seemed to be coming from the grand ballroom in the sealed-off West Wing. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my heaviest flashlight and made my way to the West Wing. The music grew louder as I approached the ballroom's massive, padlocked double doors. It was undeniably there, a ghostly melody echoing in the empty hall. My hand trembling, I found the master key and unlocked the padlock. I took a deep breath and heaved the doors open. The music stopped instantly. Inside was only darkness, silence, and the ghostly shapes of furniture covered in white sheets. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, a faint, cloying scent of old perfume. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, before I slowly backed out and locked the doors again. The final incident before the end was the most direct, and in many ways, the most terrifying. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world of impossible snowdrifts. I was clearing a path to the woodshed, the new snow so deep it came up to my waist. It was exhausting, brutal work. As I paused to catch my breath, leaning on my shovel, I saw Mrs. Gable standing on the veranda, watching me. She wasn't wearing a coat, just her usual thin, floral dress, but she seemed completely unaffected by the sub-zero temperatures. She beckoned to me with one pale, delicate finger. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I had no choice but to respond. I trudged through the deep snow and up the steps to the veranda, my boots heavy with ice. "Is there something I can get for you, Mrs. Gable?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Her smile was wider than usual, her eyes too dark, empty pools. "I seem to have misplaced my locket," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "It was a gift from my dear husband, a treasured memento. I believe it may have fallen near the old well." The blood drained from my face. I knew from the old blueprints of the lodge that the old well had been filled in with concrete and paved over in the 1950s. It was currently under the main parking lot, which itself was buried beneath at least 15 feet of densely packed snow. The old well. I stall, my mind racing. "I'm not sure where that is, ma'am. I can search the grounds for you once the snow melts a bit." Her smile didn't falter, but the emptiness in her eyes seemed to deepen, to grow colder. "Oh, but I'm quite sure that's where it is," she insisted, her voice losing its gentle tone and taking on a strange, insistent, metallic edge. "It's very important to me. You'll fetch it now." It wasn't a request. It was a command issued from a place of absolute, ancient authority. "Mrs. Gable, I can't," I stammered, gesturing with a trembling hand to the mountainous snowdrifts. "It's impossible. It's buried. It will have to wait until spring." The smile vanished. It didn't fade. It was just gone, as if it had been a mask that had suddenly dropped. Her face became a blank, emotionless porcelain slate. The change was so sudden, so complete, it was like a light being switched off. She stared at me, her gaze heavy and ancient, and the temperature on the veranda seemed to plummet another 20 degrees. I could see my breath pluming in thick, panicked clouds. She said nothing. She just stood there, motionless, her eyes boring into me with an incredible weight of disappointment and patience. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, she turned with an unnaturally smooth, gliding motion and drifted back into the lodge, the door closing silently behind her. I was left standing there, shaking violently, the cold I felt having nothing to do with the temperature. They were no longer just passive residents. They were beginning to make demands. The generator sputtered. The sound, or rather the brief, jarring interruption of its steady, life-sustaining roar, sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. It coughed once, a sick, mechanical stutter that echoed the frantic, irregular beat of my own heart. It coughed again, a wet, gurgling sound this time, a death rattle from deep within its iron lungs. Then, with a final, dying groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the lodge, it fell silent. The blizzard had long since blown itself out, leaving behind a world entombed in a cathedral of white, and the generator had been my one constant companion, the one barrier against the crushing silence and the deep, biting cold of the mountains. Its failure plunged the Silverwood Grand into a darkness so absolute and profound it felt physical, like being wrapped in thick, black, suffocating velvet. The only sound left in the entire world was the frantic, panicked pounding in my ears. A few agonizing, breathless seconds later, the emergency lights flickered on. They were weak, battery-powered things, designed only for egress, casting more shadows than light. They bathed the grand hall in a sickly, greenish-yellow glow, the color of rot and decay. The world was transformed into a hazy, underwater nightmare. It made the familiar, opulent space look alien and deeply threatening. The ornate furniture threw long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced like living things. The taxidermy heads on the walls seemed to sneer, their glass eyes glinting in the foul light. The guests were all there, gathered in the main sitting area. In the sudden, oppressive quiet, their stillness was more terrifying than any movement could have been. They weren't reading or staring out the window. They were just sitting, scattered amongst the ornate furniture, their heads all turned toward the massive, unlit stone fireplace. The emergency lights threw their faces into sharp, monstrous relief, all deep-set shadows and pale, gleaming, waxy skin. They looked like a collection of antique, malevolent dolls arranged for a silent, morbid tea party. I knew, with a certainty that bordered on raw, screaming panic, that I had to get the generator running again. The temperature inside the colossal, poorly insulated lodge would plummet quickly. While the cold didn't seem to bother them in the slightest, it was a very real and immediate threat to me. My survival, my body heat, my sanity, it all depended entirely on that machine in the sub-basement. I grabbed a high-powered flashlight from behind the front desk, its beam cutting a solid, reassuring cone of pure white light through the nauseating gloom. My hand was shaking so badly the beam danced and skittered across the walls, as if I were trying to track a frantic, invisible bird. As I started to walk past the sitting area toward the basement door, a strange and horrifying thing happened. 7 heads turned in perfect, silent, fluid unison, their eyes locking onto me. They followed my progress across the room like the automated gun turrets of a warship tracking a target. The air grew heavy, thick with a silent, unified attention that felt like a physical pressure against my skin. There was no menace in their expressions, no anger. There was just a placid, unnerving, and deeply inhuman watchfulness that was far more terrifying than any open threat could ever be. It was the look of a scientist observing an insect trapped in a jar, waiting to see what it would do next. My hand was slick with cold sweat as I fumbled with the old brass key for the basement door. The lock was stiff and cold. The darkness beyond seemed to be a solid thing, a presence waiting to swallow me whole. I took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped through, pulling the heavy door shut behind me, the latch clicking with a dreadful finality. The beam of my flashlight danced over the damp stone walls as I descended the creaking wooden stairs. The air grew colder with every step, the smell changing from musty wood to wet rock, and something else, something like old, disturbed decay. The sub-basement was even worse, a cramped, tomb-like space that housed the generator. The big diesel engine was a hulking metal beast, now ominously silent in the center of the room. I was a decent mechanic, a skill picked up from years of trying to keep my own cheap, dying cars running. I set to work, my mind desperately trying to focus on the tangible reality of tools and machinery, of cause and effect. I checked the fuel line. It was clear and full of diesel. I checked the battery terminals. They were clean and tight. I checked the filters. I spent what felt like an hour, my fingers growing numb and useless in the biting cold, and couldn't find a single thing wrong. It was as if the machine, after weeks of flawless performance, had simply decided to die. I was drenched in a cold sweat, my knuckles raw and bloody from fumbling with frozen wrenches. The silence was the worst part. Down here, I couldn't even hear the wind. There was nothing, just the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation somewhere in the darkness and the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing. Then I heard a noise from the top of the stairs, a soft, deliberate creak of a single wooden step. I froze, my entire body going rigid, the wrench slipping from my numb fingers and clattering loudly on the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and thin and pathetic in the cavernous space. There was no answer, only that suffocating silence, now somehow deeper and more expectant than before. I told myself it was just the old lodge settling, the wood contracting in the intense cold. Of course, that's what it was. I forced myself to turn back to the generator, my movements jerky and inefficient. I had to get it started. I had to get the lights and the heat back on. My flashlight beam trembled, skittering across the metal casing of the engine like a terrified insect. It is imperative that you restore the power. The voice came from directly behind me, so close I felt the vibration of it in the air against the back of my neck. It was calm, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth or any human inflection. I spun around so fast, I slipped on a patch of damp concrete and nearly fell, my flashlight beam wildly slashing through the darkness. It landed on Mr. Abernathy. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, not 10 feet away from me, his tweed suit immaculate, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. I hadn't heard him approach. I hadn't heard a single footstep on the creaking wooden stairs after that first, initial sound. It was as if he had simply materialized out of the deepest shadows. The cold, he continued, his voice a dry, papery rustle, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, is an inconvenience for the house. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Before I could find my voice, another figure appeared on the stairs behind him. One of the Sinclair sisters, her face a pale, luminous oval in the gloom. Then the other sister appeared beside her. Then Mr. and Mrs. Miller, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces blank and identical in their shared, eternal misery. They filled the narrow stairwell, a silent, unmoving tableau of death, blocking my only way out. I took a stumbling step back, my legs weak and trembling, until I bumped hard into the cold, solid metal of the generator. I'm trying, I stammered, my voice cracking with terror. I can't find the problem. Something is broken inside. Perhaps you are not looking hard enough, Mr. Abernathy said. His eyes seemed to glitter in the beam of my flashlight, reflecting the light in a way that wasn't human. It was like the eyeshine of a nocturnal predator, a deep-sea creature. And in that moment of pure, undiluted horror, I noticed something else, something so fundamentally wrong it made the world tilt on its axis. In the frigid sub-zero air of the basement, I could see my own breath erupting in thick, white clouds with every panicked gasp. They had no breath. The air in front of their faces was perfectly clear, still, and dead. They were not breathing. They were just standing there, these impossible statues, these perfectly preserved things, waiting for me to fix the machine that kept their house from freezing over. The primal, animal part of my brain took over, screaming one single, undeniable, world-shattering truth. These are not people. I knew in that instant that I wasn't going to fix the generator. My only goal, my only purpose for existing, was to get past them, to get out. I need a tool. I lied, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words. A specific wrench. A pry bar. It's in a workshop upstairs. I'll be right back. Mr. Abernathy tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was bird-like and unnatural. We will wait, he said, the words echoing strangely in the small, stone space, as if spoken down a long, dark tunnel. They made no move to part from me. They just stood there, a silent, pale wall of flesh that wasn't flesh. I had to go through them. I braced myself, my flashlight held out in front of me like a talisman, its beam wavering. I started forward, my legs feeling like lead, my boots scraping on the concrete. I had to push past Mr. Abernathy. As I reached him, my arm brushed against his sleeve. The sensation was sickening, a feeling that is seared into my memory, a feeling I will never forget as long as I live. His coat, which looked and felt like solid, rough tweed, had no substance. It was like pushing my hand through a thick, cold, dusty cobweb. It was like touching packed grave dust and brittle autumn leaves. It was cold, but it was a deep, ancient cold, a profound absence of heat that seemed to leach the life and warmth directly from my body. There was no solid flesh and bone beneath the cloth. It was like pushing through a memory of a man. I recoiled with a choked cry of disgust and terror, shoving my way past him with a surge of adrenaline. The others parted from me, a silent, flowing movement in the darkness, their bodies brushing against mine with that same unsubstantial, chilling touch. Their faces were inches from mine, their eyes empty voids. I didn't dare look at them. I scrambled up the stairs, my feet slipping on the worn wood, expecting a cold, dusty hand to grab my ankle at any second and pull me back down into the dark. But nothing happened. I burst through the door into the dimly lit main floor, and I didn't head for the workshop. I ran. I ran for the main entrance, for the snow, for the outside world, my boots skidding and sliding on the polished floors. As I fumbled with the heavy iron bolts on the front door, my fingers numb and useless, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. They were all standing there, clustered at the entrance to the grand hall, their silhouettes framed by the sickly green emergency lights. They were just watching me, their faces impassive, their forms seeming to waver and shimmer at the very edges, as if they were made of smoke and memory and held together only by sheer force of will. They weren't trying to stop me. They didn't have to. The house was the trap. They were just the bait. I finally wrenched the massive door open and threw myself out into the brutal, cleansing, life-affirming cold. The cold hit me like a physical blow, a solid wall of force that stole the air from my lungs and made me stagger to my knees in the deep snow. The world was a symphony of white and brilliant, piercing blue. The blizzard was long gone, and the sky was full of stars, so bright and clear in the thin mountain air, they looked like chips of ice scattered across black velvet. The snow glowed with a faint, ethereal light, seeming to generate a luminescence of its own. I didn't have a coat. I didn't have gloves or a hat. I only had the thin shirt and jeans I was wearing, the useless flashlight still clutched in my frozen hand, and the singular, all-consuming need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Silverwood Grand. The snowmobile was my only hope, my only chance. It was parked in a maintenance shed about 100 yards from the main lodge, a distance that now felt like crossing an entire continent on foot. Every step was a monumental struggle. The fresh snow from the blizzard was deep and light and powdery, coming up to my thighs, sucking at my legs, and trying to pull me down with every agonizing step. My lungs burned as I gasped in the freezing air, each breath a searing pain that shot all the way down to my diaphragm. I didn't dare look back. I could feel their eyes on me, a cold, metaphysical pressure against my spine. I imagined their 7 pale faces in the dark windows of the lodge, watching my pathetic, desperate flight with a detached, ancient curiosity. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight broken only by my own ragged breathing and the frantic, terrified drumming of my heart against my ribs. The lodge loomed behind me, a vast, dark shape against the starlit sky, a colossal mausoleum masquerading as a hotel. I finally reached the shed, my body shaking uncontrollably from a combination of adrenaline and the rapidly advancing effects of hypothermia. My fingers were already numb and white, stiff and clumsy as I fumbled with the heavy brass padlock on the door. It was frozen solid. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in my throat, threatening to choke me. I grabbed a nearby snow shovel and, with a guttural scream of effort and rage, slammed the metal edge against the lock again and again. The metallic clang sounded like gunshots in the profound stillness of the night, echoing off the silent face of the mountain. The lock finally shattered. I tore the door open and practically fell inside, collapsing onto the frozen dirt floor, gasping for air. The snowmobile was there, a dark, solid, beautiful shape in the gloom. The keys. I always left the keys in the ignition, a foolish, lazy habit born of my complete and total isolation. For the first time, I thank God for my own carelessness. I scrambled onto the frozen vinyl seat, my limbs stiff and uncooperative. With a trembling hand, I turned the key. The engine whined, a weak, pathetic, struggling sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast silence. It didn't turn over. My blood ran cold. I tried again. Nothing. Just that same desperate, struggling, dying noise. They had done something to it. Or maybe the intense, penetrating cold had simply killed it. The lodge would not let me leave. Despair washed over me, a wave so potent and final it almost made me want to just lie down in the snow and let the end come. It would be peaceful. It would be quiet. An end to the fear. But then I looked back at the lodge. In the main panoramic window of the grand hall, a light flickered. A warm, inviting orange light. A fire had been lit in the great stone fireplace. I could just make out the dark shapes of the guests gathering around it, drawn to the warmth like moths to a flame that wasn't meant for them. The sight of them, so calm, so patient, so eternal, sent a surge of pure, defiant rage through me. They were not going to have me. I would freeze to death out here. I would be eaten by wolves before I ever went back inside that place. I remembered the emergency pull start. It was a long shot, a brutal amount of work in this cold, especially with my strength failing so rapidly, but it was the only shot I had. I gripped the frozen plastic handle, my numb fingers barely able to close around it, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. The engine coughed, a small, weak, but promising sound. Hope, fierce and desperate and beautiful, flared in my chest. I pulled again, my muscles screaming in protest, my vision starting to blur at the edges. It sputtered. Once more, I braced myself, threw my entire body weight into it, a raw, ragged scream of effort tearing from my throat that was equal parts terror and defiance. The engine roared to life. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard, a violent, angry, wonderful roar that shattered the unnatural quiet of the mountain. I didn't wait. I slammed the snowmobile into gear and shot out of the shed, carving a deep, desperate trench through the pristine snow. I didn't know the way down the mountain, not really. I only knew the general direction of the winding access road, which was now just a vague depression under 15 feet of snow. I raced into the darkness, the single headlight cutting a frantic, bouncing path through the endless, silent, watching trees. My flight was a blur of terror. I drove for hours, following what I hoped was the memory of the road, the engine screaming. Eventually, the fuel ran out, and the snowmobile died, leaving me stranded in an ocean of white. I started walking. I don't know for how long. The cold seeped into my bones. I started to see things, a flash of a floral dress between the trees, the dark shape of a man in a tweed suit standing on a distant ridge. I was found 2 days later by a park ranger on a routine patrol, miles off course, suffering from severe frostbite on my hands and feet, and borderline delirious from hypothermia. I tried to tell him what happened. I rambled about the guests, about the diary, about their breathlessness in the cold. He just nodded, a sad, pitying look in his eyes, and told me that the high altitude and extreme isolation can do strange things to a person's mind. Cabin fever, he called it. No one ever went back to check on the lodge. By the time I was well enough to be coherent, the pass was completely inaccessible. I tried to contact Mr. Croft, but the phone number was disconnected. The company that had hired me was a shell corporation that dissolved without a trace. I never got my final paycheck. I survived, but the part of me that believed in a rational, understandable world died back there in the basement of that lodge. The guests remain, as they always have, waiting for the next snowfall, waiting for the next caretaker. The real question, the one that keeps me awake on cold nights, the one that makes me check the locks on my doors over and over, isn't why they don't leave. It's what they're waiting for. It was only weeks later, safe in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic a comforting contrast to the memory of dust and decay, that Mr. Croft's final warning replayed in my head. No longer a strange request, but a terrible, perfect truth. The guests are the lifeblood of the Silverwood, Alex. They are particular. They value their privacy above all else. You will provide for their needs. You will be courteous, but you must never, under any circumstances, ask them about their departure date. I finally understand. You don't ask the dead when they plan on moving on. You just pray you're not there when they finally decide